So good morning, good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the cluster life cycle, and today we are going to discuss the idea on the goal of the cluster of the management cluster operator. This is a meeting of is ruled by the CNCF code of conduct, so be kind of to each other. And yeah, let's start. So I started to write a CAEP. This CAEP is mostly, I take start from a similar document that was initially started by Matt. And the goal of today is just to have a quick look at summary, motivation, and then discuss goals and not goals. So summary, this is from document, and yeah, the idea is to provide, in addition to cluster cutoff CLI, to provide an operator that handles the life cycle of a management cluster, like we do together with cluster CTL, but based on CRDs. So okay, the idea is that the summary is that we want an operator. Why we want this? The main point is that in cluster cattle in its current form is designed to provide a super simple user experience for day one, and for the simplest use case, which is a cluster API management cluster with a single infrastructure provider. Okay, this design was intentional, and it also looking at the result of the recent C cluster life cycle survey. It was instrumental to expand the cluster API user base, and also to trigger an overall rationalization of cluster API provisioning, because cluster cutter is used more or less in the 50% by the 50% of the respondent. But at the same time, such a design implicitly is not optimized for the following use cases. So big infra, big cluster with many infrastructure provider or many core provider. And in this case, both installation and upgrade in cluster cattle are complex, especially for the variable management. The second use case, which is not really well addressed. Hello, thank you for unmuting. So the second use case, which is not really well addressed now by cluster cattle, is the GitOps workflow for operating the management cluster itself. So we are fine for operating the workload clusters, but the management cluster is kind of difficult to manage in a GitOps way, because you have to replicate, all the logic that is implemented in cluster cattle init or move. The other use case for which cluster cattle is not really optimized is supporting a team of administrators working on the same management cluster. And this is mostly because it is not easy to share the same, it's not easy to share the same configuration. Today, configuration are stored in variables or local config files, and this is not easy to share in a team. Then I saw Robert adding a new point. Would you like to talk about it?
Yep, I think it's pretty much the same as the GitOps model, but effectively running the same playbook in dev or staging, and then promoting that up to production, especially if you're a large cloud provider and you're running like a management cluster in your dev environment and a management cluster in your production environment.
Okay, I think that it makes sense. Do you mind if I move up near GitOps so they are?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind if you even just took it and put it as another reason in GitOps.
Let's do this way, then we can rework. Okay, so
at Weaveworks, we got the management cluster pretty much working except for upgrades and the move in a GitOps way. We had the we had the provider components in a Helm chart, the CRDs and the manifests in a Helm chart, and we had the CAPI components in a Helm chart as well. And then the cluster file split up as a single in its own Helm chart. Where we struggled with the management cluster was around the move step and also upgrades. So those are the only two items where we hit a stumbling block for the management cluster. And if those two steps can be moved to an operator as the initial priority, that would immediately allow for management of a cluster in a GitOps way.
thank you, Charles. Looking at the comment on the issue, it seems to me that many people are doing so. I have only one comment that now you are, in order to do so, basically you are forced to take charge of managing all the components of a provider. So you are taking charge of the deployments or of the webhooks and so on and so forth. And I think that moving forward, we should make this kind of simpler and basically provide an higher level an abstraction instead of handling with all the infrastructure components. But it is a good point. Let's try to address these in the goals. Some other comments on the motivation for this document, or we can move on.
So, but like one of the things that we talked about was that the first version of the cluster cuddle, well, the management cluster operator, which is kind of the new name, like wouldn't include move for a reason to simplify the move operation, because it will probably become backup and restore, and to reduce the scope of the operator rewrite at the, for the first one. So I think from what I've heard, like, I think Charles is saying like we should prioritize the move, but I would say like this probably is a future goal, and we should make it clear within this cap.
Yeah, I think one of the complexities, at least in my mind, that falls from not including move is take Helm, for example, or similar deployment tools that set like config maps or other kinds of variables during the deployment of those artifacts. If you are effectively deploying it without them, then if you tried to go back at a later date and do an upgrade or something similar, they would not be under ownership of that tool. I know some tools do support the adoption of it, though.
Yeah, this is definitely a point. Move is a kind of weird operation because it is the only operation in cluster cut that handles both providers, or is interested both in providers and in cluster objects, while all the other operations are clearly separated on the first category or in the second category. So I'm definitely +1 to keep the scope as small as possible in order to make this happen and to get this out as soon the sooner. from the other way, this is the goal of the discussion, to understand what is really required out in the field. So my idea, but yeah, feel free to chime in. My idea to kind of help in defining the scope was try to get an agreement or in what are the object or the entities that we should include in the CRD that describes a management cluster. Because if I look at today cluster cluster, when you create a cluster, so when you do init, there are many things that basically kick in. So the first one is the cert manager. So the cert manager is a requirement to get a cluster up and running, and we should decide, and in my opinion is yes, but I would like to get a feedback if the cert manager and its life cycle, so upgrade of the cert managers, for instance, or deletion of the cert manager, are under the responsibility of the of this operator, or maybe they are an optional step of this operator.
Given that cert manager is pretty effectively deployed in lots of other clusters that are not the management cluster, at least speaking on personal experience, we are deploying cert manager in lots of other places. We kind of have like the way we deploy cert manager elsewhere. So it might even be more convenient if cluster API sort of had a range of supported versions of cert manager instead, and sort of said it's your responsibility as a prerequisite to manage cert manager. I also think it would help narrow the scope of what you're trying to tackle initially.
Yeah, but my only concern is to get these as a external requisite, is that we should, the goal of Cluster Catalog at the end is to help the user to get to a management cluster which is up and running. So I would like to maintain the current experience, which is basically you get you in 2 commands you are up to the first management cluster. And so I think that we should manage cluster cattle, but make it optional. So if someone wants to use an external cert manager provided in any way, the operator should only accept it and ignore it. Which is more or less what happened today in Cluster Cattle. Cluster Cattle checks if the cert manager is missing. If it is missing, it is installed. So if missing, if already there, no, ignore it. Otherwise, manage, install, and manage. Okay, so I see that Richard just arrived. So hi, Richard. We are starting to look at this document. This document is started from your CAP, and I'm trying. What I would like to try to figure out is what are the goals, and the first idea that comes to me to define what are the goals is to try to define the entity that should be managed by this operator. So the first one that we discussed is cert manager, and we agreed that basically we should support the scenario one where a cert manager is missing and we want to install and manage, and the second one is if the cert manager is already there, we should basically use the one that is provided by the administrator. Second second object that, in my opinion, should be managed by this operator are the provider instance. So the instance of CAPI, CAPV, and all the other providers required in a cluster. I think that this is more or less the core of the operator. What is to be defined, in my opinion, is all the details that goes with a provider instance or a provider. The first point is that in cluster cattle there are the repository configuration. Typically we pull our provider components from GitHub, but you can add more repository, use local repository, whatever. So there is the repository configuration. And this is part of the configuration that a CAPI administrator can do. And we should define this is part of the CRD that we are going, or this is something that stays outside the cluster. If it stays outside the cluster, it will be really difficult to manage, for instance, upgrades. In case you're using a different repository or a provider which is not in the default one. So I think that we should have a repository configuration into the set of information that we manage, that this operator should manage and reconcile.
I was going to say, is there an alternative to having the repository for the management cluster itself in Git? In Git, it seems, I don't know, more than necessary. What a customer might want to manage maybe the GitOps using Flux. A customer might want to do it with Argo CD or with Spinnaker or other.
I think that this is a point that we should clarify. So today, cluster cattle basically fetch the YAML to install for a provider from somewhere else. Okay, and this is and basically this allows cluster cattle to provide an abstraction, which is the provider, and allows the user to don't care about all the components that build up a provider. So the deployment for the webhook, the deployment for the manager, the airbag rules, all this stuff. So these things that we call component YAML are fetched by cluster cattle and managed by cluster cattle. Okay. In my opinion, exposing these and in my opinion, the operator should continue to keep this layer of abstraction, which is the provider and the provider instance. I don't think that we should, if we are going to expose these objects to the users, we are removing an important part for cluster cattle. We are removing also a big part of a cluster cattle, because if you work at this lower level, it's difficult to understand what is in your cluster, how to plan upgrades, how to check if your management cluster is consistent. So managing this higher level is, in my opinion, is required. So what I do expect is that people manage in their GitHub a YAML object, which is the provider, but behind the scene, the management cluster operator goes and fetch the components YAML and install and manage all this stuff. So in my opinion, we should get this layer of abstraction.
so could I give a counterpoint then? Are you saying then that the cluster control operator would have to be able to authenticate to a Git repository? Because now you'd have to cover use cases of SSH not being accessible and having to do username, password. Maybe it's not a Git repository. Maybe it's a HTTP endpoint. I mean, these are problems that you're now talking about, that things like Cap Controller and Argo CD and Flux are designed to handle, right? So I would say that you might be conflagrating where I would really want cluster CTL operator, like knowing the order of operations and things that they should probably occur with, versus getting them and bringing them to the cluster that it would then be conducting those operations on.
I'm inclined to agree with Robert on that. We have some very large banking customers that while they deal with Weaveworks, they simply want nothing to do with GitOps. They want a Jenkins operation that pushes a manifest with kubectl, and the operator should respect that change from the manifest and handle the operations in order. But having implicit GitOps in a cluster, either with Flux, with Flux or Argo or any other GitOps style tool, would immediately put us on sort of the defensive with very many change management teams and the sort of customers we want to get this tool into. So there needs to be a clear demarcation of how the changes are applied into the cluster and how the operator affects them. In my humble opinion, the operator should see that the changes have been pushed into the cluster and operate against them. How they get into the cluster should be external to cluster CTL, and cluster CTL should not do that. So that way, one customer that wants to use Argo, one customer who wants to use Flux, one customer wants to use Jenkins, another customer that wants to use whatever other shell scripting or delivery mechanism, they can do that. And we don't fall prey of those very large, especially banking customers that don't like to be forced to use this sort of thing.
Yeah, I would like to. Hi, I'm V. I work at Capital One with Andrew, and we're doing something. We just launched a platform that is many clusters with centralized management clusters. We would like to. We're not yet at a point where we can share that out, but we would like to align and contribute to this effort. And our delivery mechanism for these type of resources is not using GitOps. It's simply something we can't use because per our enterprise requirements. We use a custom delivery mechanism, and we operate it on resources once they enter the Kubernetes system.
So bringing us back to the idea of having like a CRD, in my mind, and what I liked about that idea of introducing like a CRD is if you had like the template for a provider in the form of some kind of a CRD or something, where now cluster CTL is taking what it would be grabbing from a Git repository and just grabbing from that definition and applying it. And maybe the version 001 of that CRD is basically just a YAML and a config map or something. I guess what I'm trying to say is like is how what would be applied to the cluster that a banking customer or anyone else could say, here, you're still kubectl applying it, you still have full control over the fetch and application to your cluster, but now you have something running inside that cluster that's effectively taking that and doing it in the correct order.
Yep, that would work for some of our banking customers, for defense type, military type customers. They don't want. I mean, Weaveworks is the GitOps company, and these customers simply say, no, we want Weaveworks in there, but we want nothing to do with GitOps. So we provide them some other sort of tool chain while they get. It's a case of education and getting them comfortable. In 2-3 years' time, they'll come round to it. You know, they will come round to having Flux or Argo CD or whatever the tool may be. But forcing them to do it, we would then just lose them as a CAPI customer, and that's my biggest concern.
Okay, but I kind of agree. The design is not going to force to use any tools. And just to try to go back, if I look at the proposal that was linked to the issue, it's kind to define a provider spec. So which is really simple. I want this provider copy type. It is a core provider version. I want v0 3.9. I want this provider to be installed watching the namespace default or whatever, and maybe I'm going to provide some more configuration for my provider. Is that right, Richard? I'm reading right your document?
Yeah, that's reading right. It's not my document. This is someone else's, I think.
It's from Max. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. Okay, but sorry, I confused the people. But okay, so this is a simple abstraction that hides all the complexity of what a provider is. Okay, and more or less it is the same level of abstraction that is used by Cluster Cattle today. Okay, and in fact this is a small variation of the current CRD used by Cluster Cattle. And the idea is that when a user applies, no matter if it applies using GitHub or using kubectl or in using a program, when the user applies this YAML, this API to the cluster, then the operator will take charge of installing installing all the other components. And from that moment on, he will take care of managing upgrades and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, what is this point is that in Cluster Cattle, we have to tell Cluster Cattle how to fetch all detail of the providers. Okay, now this fetching can work on go to fetch a spec from GitHub. Okay, but it can work also fetching from other sources. So in that way, our Cluster Cattle already supports all the use cases for people that don't want to fetch from internet. They want to manage their own copy of manifest or component manifest and whatever. So we are already supporting this. The point is that if this kind of we want to embed this kind of flexibility into the operator or not. In my opinion, yes, because I want the operator to provide the same functionality that we already have, just in a different way.
Yeah, I think that proposal that Max has written is a good first stab. That would solve a lot of the GitOps scenarios, wouldn't it? Where you just apply an instance of that, then it will install all of the providers. Would be good to have those other config options available, so I can pull the manifest from somewhere else, override that in like an air-gapped environment or something like that. But yeah, I guess that proposal is how I sort of had it in my head, and how I would use it. So I quite like that.
Thank you.
So for my edification, am I understanding it correctly to assume that, okay, maybe it's not tied necessarily to GitOps, but it still needs to pull from somewhere?
Yeah, I think just to clarify, I think maybe just maybe I think there's some confusion in terms. I think when we talk about pulling from GitHub, we mean going to a repo, checking the releases, and getting the latest release, which is what Cluster Cattle is doing right now. So not not GitOps in the sense of reconciling against the Git repository. We're talking purely the current behavior of using GitHub releases mechanism as a way to fetch versions of cluster API components. Is that right, Fabrizio?
Yeah, thank you. And is it only a way to fetch from somewhere, and somewhere can be anything, can be a GitHub release, can be a local repository, can be an HTTPS point. So we have to figure out how to make it works from inside the cluster.
Another option is also a Helm chart for the cluster components and the provider components. And having the management operator be able to be notified that a new version has been made available and should upgrade to that new version. That's something we partially had working, in that we had the install from a Helm repository or from a Git repository using a Helm chart. Again, where we couldn't proceed was around the upgrade. So if you say you don't want to do the move at the moment, and the move should be switched to a backup / restore, that's acceptable. But the upgrade, if we can have it such that the upgrade can, if the operator can just handle the upgrade and handle it either from a, like you say, HTTPS Git repo, or a Helm repository, or so forth, then that would allow organizations to handle every possible scenario. Because some organizations just don't have access to GitHub externally. But if they could have an internal harbor or Artifactory or whatever, where they can point at the Helm chart for the provider components and the CAPI components, that solves that issue. Whether it's a Helm chart or just a flat file system or that sort of thing, HTTPS endpoint, some organizations don't even have a Helm repository. So those scenarios work. But it should be an explicit push to the customer. kubectl apply, I want this version, and you can find it here.
Okay, I think that now we have a kind of agreement. So it's something that it is required. We are not imposing constraints. We are just moving what Cluster Cattle is doing now to a GitOps approach, and we are splitting basically and this is the configuration for the fetch part. Okay, similar, we have some options that today are supported by Cluster Cattle. For instance, we allow to configure image override. So when you fetch, then you apply image override. So you can make your user to use a local repository instead of the one which is embedded in the official manifest, or things like that. And again, is a kind of configuration that applies on the fetched components. So in my opinion, it falls in the same category. And the last point is that when I install a provider, I usually do apply a set of variables or flags to the provider instance, and this should be part of the API that we are going to define. I don't know if it should be a specific API type, or we can use secrets or whatever, but it should be part of the domain. And basically, the set of all this information will be recorded when I do init, or will be defined when I do init, and will be the base for doing upgrades. And so this is the minimum base. And yeah, then I wrote two other possible entities that are in the scope of this operator. one is the management group, which is basically a set of providers that works together. And today it is implicit, and it only surface when you do upgrades. But it is, in my opinion, could be interesting because it will allow to make operational group of containers. So I want this group of containers to upgrade from V1 Alpha 3 to V1 Alpha 4. So this allows me to change only one entity, one object in my cluster, and then have the change to propagate. The last one are cluster templates. So cluster templates today are managed by Cluster Cattle, but in light also of what Vince was telling before, I personally, I'm leaning to keep them out of the scope of the Cluster Cattle operator initially. Of the management cluster operator, because cluster template are not part of the management cluster. They are workload cluster, and we already have many ways to manage them. Okay. So trying to move on, we are nearly at time, but hopefully we can get this, or at least start a discussion. So assuming that we have an high-level agreement of what is the scope in terms of API, the next step that in my opinion we should define is what kind of operation the operator should manage. So I think that some of them are really, let me say, easy to agree upon, which is okay. Init, that means install an initial set of provider, add a new provider to the initial set, and then there is, so this is the installation part. Then there is a group of operation on provider which are upgrade. So for instance, upgrade a full management group to latest in the same contract, which is the current behavior of Cluster Cattle upgrade. So I want to get the latest release for all my provider in V1 Alpha 3 series. Then I think that we should start thinking also to the upgrade to the next contract. So I want to upgrade my management group to V1 Alpha 4. Or this is also another operation supported by Cluster Cattle upgrade. I want to upgrade a specific set of provider or a single provider. So I want my AWS provider instance to move to V06.1. Then there are a set of delete. So I want to delete a single provider or an entire manager group, so copy with all the providers that are related. This operation is not currently supported by Cluster Cattle, but I think that the operator should support it. So I want to change an installed provider. For instance, I want to change a flag. I want to enable profiling. I want to change the sync loop because I'm debugging, or thing like that. And then we get to move. I think that I tend to agree with Vince, because if we look at move, now move basically moves only the installed cluster, so the workload cluster, and the workload cluster is kind of out of scope from all these entities that we discussed so far. Opinions?
So feature-wise, and in terms of what we're trying to do are pretty much like this. The only challenge I see or concern is the API that we're going to surface for this. We'll likely need to ensure that that is pretty much declarative and we're not embedding any operations or something like that. Fabrizio, if you recall, like with the KubeADM operator, it was one of the challenges that we've seen.
Yeah, I agree, but I agree, and this is why I try to define the scope of the API as the first thing, because modeling the API in a declarative way will take some work. Okay, so we are at time, and I'm going to post the recording to the channel, and my next takeaway is that starting from this initial surface, I should try to draft an API, and the next, and then I will we can iterate on offline on the document, or if people prefer, I can arrange another meeting.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds really good.
Thank you everyone for contribution.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.